Okay, y'all, just a few minutes. We're trying to get our guest. We're having a little technical difficulty, but we'll get there. So happy to have you guys join us this evening. Oh, let's see. Just a couple of more minutes. Okay. That's right. You using the house. How y'all doing? Thank you for hanging in there with us. All will be well. Thank y'all for showing up early. Wonderful. We're so excited. This is just the opportunity to thank you guys. Thank you guys for reading us. Thank you guys for watching us. Thank you guys for supporting us. Please continue to support us. We can't do it without you guys. And we love being able to bring you Black history and all these other great things every day. So thank you. All right. Hi.
Hi there.
How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. We are just so pleased to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. And so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Leslie Grover, and I am a writer for Push Black, but we are pleased to have with us poet and author of the book, How the Word is Passed, Clint Smith. Thank you for joining us.
I'm so glad to be here. I'm a big fan of Push Black. What they say, first time, long time listener, first time caller. So,
Oh, wow. Thank you.
yeah.
I have to say, we are definitely fans of How the Word is Passed. That you're a poet is so beautifully written.
Thank you.
And so we have to thank you. I have to call you out because I know for a fact from reading the book, which we're going to get in for a second, that you got people from Mississippi.
I do. I have a
You
lot of people
do.
from Mississippi.
So I'm originally from Mississippi, which I call the motherland.
There you go.
And I know you grew up in New Orleans, and I too spent several years in New Orleans
Mm.
at Dillard working. So
Oh,
I feel
wonderful.
like you kin folks already.
Yes, indeed. We got that connection.
Absolutely. So tell us how the word is passed. Tell us about the book and what inspired you to write it.
So, How the Word is Passed is was born in May of 2017, and I was looking at the Confederate statues come down in my city, in my hometown, and thinking about, you know, watching the statue of Robert E. Lee, P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, and watching these memorials to the Confederacy be taken down, and thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? And what does it mean that on the way to school, I went down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Highway. To get to that my middle school was named after someone who was a leader in the Confederacy, that my parents live on a street named after somebody who owned 150 enslaved people, that when I went on field trips as a kid to plantations, nobody said the word slavery. And so thinking about all of that as part of the ecosystem I grew up in, and how these homages to enslavers were the iconography and the ornamentation that shaped the landscape of my city, I thought about, like, well, what does that mean? Because we know that symbols and names are not just symbols and names and memorials; they are reflective of stories that we tell, and these stories are shaped. They shape and embed themselves into the narratives that societies carry, and these narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And so, I wanted to think about, like, how did the sort of landscape of New Orleans, a place that was literally constructed by the hands of enslaved labor, as so many other cities across this country were. What does it mean that it was surrounded by that sort of iconography? And I sort of started thinking about how different parts of New Orleans reckoned with or failed to reckon with their relationship to the history of slavery, and then sort of broadened it out and started thinking about how did different places across this country and even across the ocean confront this history, and in what ways do so many of them fail to? And I really sort of wanted to create a project that captured the patchwork of experiences and the patchwork of memories that shape how our society collectively understands and often fails to understand the legacy of slavery and how it shaped the contemporary society that we live in.
Yeah, I love that. So I want to kind of pick at you a little bit on that question
Mm-hmm.
with a further point, because, yeah, we completely understand that history of slavery is something that shapes or that did shape a lot of things. But to those people who say, look, I'm tired of seeing Black pain. Why do we have to talk about our people as coming from slaves when we really came from royalty, when we have roots that go deeper than that? What do you say to those people, and why should they care in 2021 about things that happened hundreds of years ago?
No, it's a good question. So I'll answer it in a couple ways. So one, I think that we can take for granted how close we are and how proximate we are to this period of time. I think that slavery is one of these things that we talk about and we're taught about it as if it's something that happened in the Jurassic Age, right? It was like the dinosaurs and the Flintstones and slavery, right? But slavery existed in this country for 250 years. If we're going to think about 1619 as being the sort of symbolic marker of the beginning of slavery in the British North American colonies, and then ending in 1865, existed in this country for 250 years and has only not existed for about 150. And so this institution that existed for 100 years longer than it hasn't, that existed for over a century before we were even a country, the idea that that would have nothing to do with what our contemporary landscape of inequality looks like is both morally and intellectually disingenuous, right? The woman who opened the museum alongside the Obama family in 2016, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, who rang the bell to sort of signal the opening of this museum, was the daughter of an enslaved person, not the granddaughter, not the great-great-granddaughter, but like the daughter of someone in 2016 who had been born into bondage. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So when I think about my 4-year-old son sitting on my grandfather's lap, I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I'm reminded again that this history that we're told was a long time ago was not in fact that long ago at all. There are people who are alive today who were raised by, who loved, who lived in community with people who were born into bondage. So part of what I wanted to do with this book was give us a sense of our physical proximity to the landscape of slavery, but also a sort of temporal proximity, right? Because this wasn't that long ago. We are only a few generations removed from this. And to the second part of that, I am, excuse me, I am sympathetic to the idea that we should not have stories that singularly focus and center on Black pain and Black trauma. I agree with that. I think that Blackness is one of the most beautiful, heterogeneous, pluralistic, diverse things in the world, right? And there are millions of us with millions of different experiences, and all of those experiences should be reflected in our literature, in our media, in our history, absolutely. But part of the insidiousness, I think, of white supremacy is that it makes you feel as if you talk about something all the time, and makes you feel like you talk about slavery all the time, or that we're inundated with slavery content all the time, when we're actually in no way engaging with it or thinking about it or receiving content related to that period in any way that is commensurate with the impact that that period of time actually had on this country, right? Like in 1860, the 4 million enslaved Black people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined, worth more than all the manufacturing that this country had in its totality in 1860, according to the historian David Blight at Yale University, were the bodies of enslaved people. So the reason, right, I think a lot of people know in the abstract, like, oh, this country was built on the backs of enslaved people. We were, we're the reason the U.S. is such a superpower. But like quite literally, the reason that the United States exists as a global economic superpower today is inextricably linked to the bodies and labor and exploitation of millions of enslaved people across generations. And so I think that it is important for us, both because of our proximity to that period of time, and because we don't actually engage with it in the way that is commensurate with the impact that it had. And part of the insidiousness of anti-Blackness is that it makes you feel like, oh, well, we got 12 years a slave, and like, and now Underground Railroad, there's too many slave movies, or too many slave series, or too many, why are we always making these things about slavery? But nobody says that about World War II movies. Nobody says that about Westerns. There's a World War II movie nominated for an Academy Award every year, right? But no one would say we have too many World War II movies. And so the idea that we have, quote unquote, too many or too much literature or history or movies or what have you related to the history of slavery, I think reflects the way that we have been inundated with messages and sometimes internalized messages that this country has given us, because this country doesn't want to talk about it and they don't want us to think about it, right? And so again, that is not to say that like we shouldn't have books and movies that reflect a range of Black experiences. We absolutely should. But I also think we should take seriously what it means to have media and scholarship and literature related to enslavement that engages rigorously with that period of time, so that we can more effectively understand how that period of time has shaped the economic, political, and social infrastructure of our world today.
Awesome. Yes, absolutely. So, you talked about a wide range of experiences across our Blackness. Your book has a wide ranges of places that you visited.
Mm.
My goodness, from a Confederate cemetery to, to places in Africa. How did you pick which places you were going to include in the book?
Yeah, so I went to dozens of places, and I ended up writing about 8 of them. And so, one of the places that I go is Angola Prison. Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It is built, it is 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It's a place where 75% of the people held there are Black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences. And it is a place that is built on top of a former plantation. And what I tell folks is that if you were to go to Germany and you had the largest maximum security prison in Germany, and it was built on top of a former concentration camp in which the people held there were disproportionately Jewish, that place would be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. And rightfully so. It would be abhorrent. It would be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist, because it would run counter to all of our moral and ethical sensibilities. People would be protesting outside of it every day, and they should be, because we would never want a place like that to exist. And yet here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country, where the vast majority of people held there are Black men serving life sentences, working on fields that was once a plantation, with somebody watching them on horseback with a gun over their shoulder while they pick crops for virtually no pay. And so part of what I'm exploring in a place like Angola is, what are the ways that white supremacy not only enacts physical violence against people's bodies, but also collectively numbs us to certain types of violences that in another global context would be wildly unacceptable, right? And what does it mean not only that that place attempts to avoid having any sort of meaningful discussion about its relationship to the history of slavery that literally exists on that land, but also that that place has a museum. It has a museum that doesn't say the word slavery from what I could tell anywhere. And connected to that museum, connected to the largest maximum security prison in the country, is a gift shop where they sell shot glasses and coffee mugs and baseball caps and ashtrays and all sort of paraphernalia that is in many ways making a mockery of the experiences that people are living in today. One of the places or the things that I saw in this gift shop at Angola is there was a coffee mug that had the silhouette of a watchtower on it. And in the watchtower, you could see the silhouette like of a small person, a small guard, and you could see the silhouette of their little gun. And above and below the silhouette were the words Angola, a gated community. And so it is not only that Angola prison is not talking directly and honestly about its relationship to slavery, it is that it is belittling and making light of the oppressive nature of what thousands of people continue to experience on that land. You go to Germany, places like Auschwitz and some of these other concentration camps that have been turned into museums, they have gift shops and restaurants and things like that, but they are tastefully done. And they aren't places where people continue to be held, right? So I think that that's a meaningful distinction. And so for me, I wanted to go to a place like Angola because I wanted to use the landscape, and the imagery of the place are so clearly connected to the history of slavery, which is not to say that prison is slavery, right? Like, I think that that is also an important distinction to make. And sometimes people can use it as shorthand, and they can be like, oh, prisons, mass incarceration is the new slavery, or prisons are slavery by another name. And I think I'm sympathetic to that, but I also think that these are like phenomenologically distinct entities, right? And that like prison, we don't have to say that one thing is another in order to name the cruelty that is inherent to each one in a distinctive and specific way, right? And I think the most meaningful difference is that chattel slavery was a system in which you were someone's property, and then your child was that person's property, and then their child was that person's property, and that, which is very different than how the system of incarceration works, which is not to say, we know sociologically that if you have an incarcerated parent, you are more likely to end up entangled in the criminal legal system, but that is different from your inherent status as a person being classified as chattel because of who your mother is. And so all that to say, I thought it was a really interesting place to be able to tease out some of these similarities, but also some of these distinctions, to make sure that when we're engaging in our analysis of oppressive systems, we're being precise. Because I think if we're not precise, we can sort of undermine our work, and we can undermine the valid points that we're otherwise trying to make. So that's one place, but I go to Monticello Plantation, Whitney Plantation, Galveston, Texas, New York City, Dakar, Senegal, and I think each of those places has something to say about why our country and even why parts of Western Africa have the sort of, to what extent they have reckoned or failed to reckon again with their relationship to this history.
Absolutely. Let's talk. So I went to Whitney Plantation.
Mm-hmm.
I visited it, and I have a son.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking at the wall where all the names of, our people were written. And
Right.
there was a woman who had a name that was very similar to mine.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that it also listed her son with her. And so as I went through Whitney Plantation and started looking at things, I felt a connection with her while I was there.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to feel her. I tried to think about, what she would have experienced, what her son was experiencing, because at the time, like, I was there with my son. And it was so powerful for me to have that experience. Was there a place that resonated with you in your travels like that?
Yeah, I mean, in so many ways, so many of them did. I mean, I think, if we're going to talk about the Whitney is so special in so many ways because it is, for those who aren't familiar, the Whitney Plantation is the only plantation museum in Louisiana and one of the only plantations in the country that centers the lives of enslaved people rather than the lives of the enslavers. Because what is typical, unfortunately, is you go to museums and they talk about the people who lived in the big house and they talked about the architecture of the house and where the windows came from and where they imported the dishes from um, and will tell you a sort of entire history and lineage of the people who lived in that home without sometimes even mentioning the people who made that home possible. Um, and so the Whitney is special because it is surrounded by a constellation of these plantations in Louisiana where people continue to hold weddings, where people are, celebrating one of the most joyous days of their lives in the homes of former enslavers, where people, I've talked to wedding planners where people use the former slave cabins as bridal suites for these ceremonies. And so, and the Whitney is a place that rejects the idea that we can understand a plantation as anything other than a site of intergenerational torture, right? Like a plantation was a site, and we don't frame it as torture as often as I think we certainly many scholars do, but in our public discourse, like these were torture sites. They are sites in which people were exploited and tortured and pushed to the brink emotionally, psychologically, physically, in order to maximize the profit of the enslaver and the planter class. And they also exist, so they do that, but also exist as a place that center the humanity of enslaved people, right? And are not simply thinking of enslaved people as statistics, or not thinking of them as, to your previous point, defined by their pain or defined by the trauma or defined by the oppression they experienced. That these are people who, in the context of unimaginable circumstances that many of us can't even begin to fathom, carved out a meaningful life for themselves, found spaces of love, built community, created families, and resisted the institution in small but meaningful ways every single day. I think we often think of resistance in the form of like a slave rebellion, or somebody running away, or like slitting the throat of an enslaver. But like those are very limited notions of what resistance looks like, and they're often also very gendered notions of what resistance looks like. But I think resistance happened in slavery from the moment enslaved people were first brought here in the early 17th century. And so I like the Whitney. The Whitney is a place, that's all to say, that centers that experience, and make sure that when you come there, you are getting a better sense of the experience of the enslaved than you would probably anywhere else. And part of what they do is they make sure that you understand the experiences of enslaved people who weren't the sort of superstars, so to speak, or the sort of exceptional characters that we often engage with, the Harriet Tubmans, the Frederick Douglasses, the Olaudah Equianos, the Harriet Jacobs, the people who wrote, with the exception of Tubman, who wrote these autobiographies that were the thing that gave most people insight into what the experience of slavery was. And those autobiographies are deeply important. I mean, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass is one of the most important books I've ever read, and remains and will remain one forever. But Frederick Douglass is like not a regular dude, like he was
Right.
not even like, he was not even like an exceptional enslaved person. He was just like an exceptional person. Same with Harriet Tubman, same with so many of these folks. Is that like, these are exceptional individuals whose experiences and circumstances are not reflective of the totality of, or who are not reflective of the vast majority of what most enslaved people live through. And so what I like about the Whitney too is that they are making sure that you are thinking about the people who are not the people we typically consider when we go. And I went there, the first time I did my reporting, I went there alone, and had a really meaningful experience in alone. But then I also went 7 or 8 months later with my entire family. Everybody was in town for Thanksgiving, and we went with my family, and including my grandmother, my wife, my kids, my parents. And it was powerful. I mean, to see my grandmother so emotionally moved by this place that, and I interview my grandmother at the end of the book in the epilogue, But like she recounted to me about being taught that slavery. She was like, I was taught, and my grandmother's 80 years old, born in 1939, Jim Crow apartheid Florida. And she was like, I was taught that Africans were savages. I was taught that the best thing that ever happened to black people was being put on these ships and brought here. I was taught that slavery was a civilizing and benevolent institution, right? Like, and that's the insidiousness of white supremacy and anti-blackness, is that you have this little girl growing up in 1940 Mississippi, in 1940 Florida, who's being inundated with these messages that her ancestors, having been captured and forcibly removed from that land, was good for them, and having been brought into chattel slavery was good for them. And so the things that she is hearing at the Whitney are fundamentally transforming and helping her unlearn, even at 80 years old, so much of what she had learned throughout her childhood. And it was so moving to her, because she was like, nobody ever talked about slavery like this to us. And I think that that's the experience that a lot of folks have when they go there. And that's, it's not to say that Whitney is perfect. It's not this, people go and experience museums in all sorts of different ways. And so other people might go and have a very different experience. But it was a really powerful one for me, and one that will stay with me for a long time, in part because of how I saw, in part because these spaces have the possibility, like in a 90-minute tour or 60-minute tour, you can engage folks who might not ever pick up a book about this subject, right? Like, the irony is that I wrote a book about this, and I hope many people read it and pick it up. But I also am acutely cognizant of the fact that there are people who will go on a 60-minute tour who won't pick up a 300-page book. And I think that part of what I wanted to do with this book is like take those places seriously, and take the people who tell the stories of that land seriously, and lift up their voices, the voices of the public historians and the tour guides and the descendants and the curators who at a place like Monticello sees hundreds of thousands of people every year. The Whitney Plantation before the pandemic had 100,000 people come visit that plantation, which is more than who will read almost any book about the history of slavery. And so I think, these places have a unique opportunity to bring in and communicate this history to folks who might not know it at all, or who might only know it on a sort of surface level.
Wonderful. Brilliant. Welcome to those who are just joining us. We have the absolute pleasure today of talking with Clint Smith. He's author of the book, How the Word is Passed. So welcome. So, you mentioned something about exceptionality. You did something that was so exceptional in this book. You went to a Confederate cemetery. And I mean, y'all, this is like the ultimate of when the Confederate flags, when you think of all of this anti-Black stuff, it's not hate, it's heritage. And not only did you go to the cemetery, you had nerve enough to stick with these people and talk to them and ask them questions. Like, so I have to ask you this. I really have to really get into this. When you talk about stories and connections and what they teach us, when we think about the Confederates, it was basically white terrorism, definitely. And it was also definitely, a group who fought to keep slavery legal. So I just have so many questions. What drove you to examine this group, right? Because you could have kept it Black. The book is awesome. You're an amazing writer, whatever. So you could have kept the book Black. It still would have been as powerful. So I guess the first part of the question is, what drove you to, go and explore this place and to talk about what's going on? And then what was it with the stories? How do you think those stories define those people who are really like great believers in this, who really feel this as part of their history?
Yeah. So That's the Blanford Cemetery in Petersburg, Virginia. It is one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country. The remains of 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried there. And I went there for the Sons of Confederate Veterans Memorial Day celebration, as you alluded to. And so I should also say you will probably hear my children in the background because
It's
it's
okay.
bedtime. And
Sure.
so releasing a book and having book events at this hour means that they are often the sort of background noise of all these events. Um, and so I went to, I didn't, the background is that I didn't initially intend to go to this place. Like when I wrote this book proposal, I wasn't like, I'm going to go to this Confederate cemetery and like, I'm going to meet the neo-Confederates and talk. Like that was not at all a part of my expectation.
Sure.
Part of the thing I loved about the book was that you have like an idea of the places you're going to go and write about, and then you go, and then these places take you on their own journey. And so I actually had an idea to write about Civil War battlefields, and so I was really interested in Civil War battlefields and how those were remembered and commemorated. And so I went to Petersburg to explore this place that was tied to the Siege of Petersburg, which was one of the major sieges of the Civil War toward the end of the war. And I went on this tour, and it was fascinating and interesting. And I was like, okay, I might be able to write about this. And I was telling the tour guide about my project, one of the national park rangers, and he was like, oh, that's interesting. You should go to the Blanford Cemetery. It's a Confederate cemetery. It's about 10 minutes up the road. And I was like, a Confederate cemetery? And I had never been to a Confederate cemetery. That's not something I decide to do in my spare time very often. But I was like, Confederate cemetery. Okay, let me go check this out. And so I went to the cemetery, and I got up this tour that was going around the chapel of the cemetery, and was talking about the beauty of the stained glass windows, and it was interesting because it was an hour-long tour of a chapel on the grounds of a Confederate cemetery, and didn't say the word Confederate once. And I was like, that's interesting that we're spending all this time talking about the beauty of the windows without saying anything about why these windows were constructed or like who they were constructed to honor. And then I went back to the visitor center, and I was talking to the woman who runs the center, and I looked down, and I was like, what is this flyer in front of me? And then she like put her hand on the flyer real quick, and tried to cover it up. And I was like, what is she doing? And I could see between her fingers that it was a flyer for the Sons of Confederate Veterans Memorial Day event that would be held a few weeks later. And I was, as a journalist, I was like, okay, well, the story is pointing me in the direction I need to go. So I went back. My wife wouldn't let me go to a Sons of Confederate Veterans event by myself, understandably. And so she was like, you need to take your white friend. And so I called my white friend, Billy. Shout out to Billy. And he went with me. And it was interesting because he's on his own journey of thinking about and reckoning with his history to the Confederacy. He has ancestors who fought for the Confederacy. He has ancestors who enslaved other people. And so he was on his own sort of journey, and this was a sort of process through which to engage that on his end. But we went, and it was clarifying, I think, because I think there are some people in this country for whom history is not based on primary source documents. It's not based on empirical evidence. It's not based on historical fact. It's a story that people have been told, and a story that they tell. It is an heirloom. It is a piece of their lineage. It is a tradition. It is something that is something they are emotionally invested in because it helps give them a sense of who they are in the world. And at the end of this chapter, I talk about a guy named Greg who says that you're asking me if I'm to accept that the Civil War was fought over slavery, you're asking me to accept that my great-great-granddaddy was a monster. And it's interesting because for me, I'm actually not interested in whether you think about your great-granddaddy as a monster or not. I'm not interested in the interiority of your grandfather's heart, the same way that I don't care if somebody has a racist heart or racist bones or any of that, because that doesn't actually mean anything.
Right.
So it doesn't matter to me if you think your grandfather fought for was a monster or not, but it does matter to me that you accept that he fought for a monstrous cause. And I think that there are a lot of people who are unable to make that jump because then it feels like it's a rejection of the people they've loved or the stories that they've been told. But I was talking, I very much believe that like you have to, in this certain context, and in this context, like I wanted to understand. Like I was trained by a lot of sociologists in graduate school, and so just kind of like sociologically, I wanted to understand like what makes you believe this thing, even though and I'm not operating as some sort of objective or neutral party. Like it's very clear when you read the book where I stand. But I also wanted to give space for them to say what they had to say. And I didn't want to approach them in an antagonistic way. I didn't want to approach them in a way that was trying to like prove them wrong or, in the moment. I was like, I really want to understand why you believe what you believe. And I think that they opened up to me, and told me some things that were surprising, but also clarifying. And I think also of a guy named Jeff, who I met there, and he's sort of like, he was wearing this biker vest, long ponytail, long goatee, big aviator sunglasses. The denim biker vest is adorned in Confederate flags and paraphernalia. And he was telling me this story about how he used to come to this cemetery with his grandfather, and they used to sit in the gazebo, and they would watch as the sun set at dusk, and they would watch as the deer sort of scampered through the tombstones. And his grandfather would sing him songs and tell him stories about all the men who were buried in this land, and how good they were, and that they fought to protect their families and fought to protect the honor of their communities. And so this is a story that Jeff grows up with that is deeply entangled in his emotional relationship to his grandfather. And so Jeff is not going to simply, if you're like, well, Jeff, actually, if you look at the Declarations of Confederate Secession, if you look at Alexander Stephens' Cornerstone speech, if you look at the nature of the Crittenden Amendments that were proposed before the Civil War in order to prevent the South from seceding, all of it made clear that the Confederacy was a treasonous army that was predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery. Like, that's not an opinion. That's what it was, right? Because they said it for themselves. You look at the Declarations of Confederate Secession in 1861, a state like Mississippi says, our interests are thoroughly in line with the institution of slavery, the greatest material good in the world. So that these folks aren't vague about why they're seceding. They say it quite directly. But it's not about that for him. And what happens is that now he talks about how one of the things he loves the most is bringing his granddaughters to that land and walking across the land with them and telling them that his grandfather, who had told him these stories, who's now buried in that land, how good of a man he was and how good of a man his great-great-granddaddy was. And so it goes on and perpetuates itself intergenerationally. But Jeff, I part of what I think about is like, Jeff could make a different set of decisions. Like, how much more powerful would it be if Jeff took his granddaughters there and said, these are your ancestors, and they fought a war for a horrible thing, and you don't have to be defined by the decisions or the decisions that they made or the actions that they took. And we can look back at what our ancestors did and say that was wrong, and that's not okay, and that's not who I am or who our family will continue to be. How freeing would that be to those little girls? How freeing would that be to him? So it was a fascinating experience, an unsettling experience, and a clarifying one. And I think I learned a lot about how history is remembered and misremembered, and how the lost cause sort of lives on. And I wanted to go to a place, to answer part of your question, like that, because I wanted to have something that served as a juxtaposition to the Whitney, right? Where like the Whitney was trying to correct so much of the insidiousness of the project that is reflected in that Sons of Confederate Veterans event. Because the lost cause was so effective in distorting this country's understanding of what the Civil War was and what slavery was. Even today, in 2018, the Southern Poverty Law Center had a study that showed that only 8% of U.S. high school seniors were able to identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. Like, wow. 8%. And so this isn't an issue that just was an issue in, the late 19th century, the early 20th century. This is an issue today. And I think it is a part of, I think, memory, which is at the center of this book, and how we remember. ultimately shapes what sort of society we are able to build moving forward.
Absolutely. Our time with you is running short, but
Oh,
this is wonderful. Thank you for being here for our viewers. Thank you for doing this. And you guys, the book, How the Word is Passed, you can purchase that by clicking the link in our bio. It's right there. So the last question I ask you, you you have definitely with this book made the case for number one why we should care. You've shown us how the word is passed, literally, which is beautiful. So I want to ask you, if we were to build a monument
mm,
for our people, one that could say address racism,
mm,
and we wanted to pass that story,
mm.
what would a monument look like that? What would that monument look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll say this and qualify this by saying that there are some amazing, incredible visual artists who are doing some remarkable work around this in places across the country. And I'm not a visual artist, far from it. My stick figures look the same as they did in third grade. Um, and so I don't purport to know exactly what they should look like. But I think we can invoke Germany again. Uh, and something that I think is interesting about Germany is that they have these things called stumbling stones, or that's the English translation of them. And there are tens of thousands of uh, brass bricks, these sort of golden bricks that rise up from the ground. And they are scattered throughout the country in places like Berlin. And if you walk up to a Nike store or a yoga studio or a donut shop or a McDonald's, sometimes what you'll see on like a small brass plate that's slightly elevated off the ground are the names of people, of family members, and those are the people who were taken from that that building, that former home, and who were sent to concentration camps and death camps throughout Germany. And it has their names, it has the date they were taken, and it tells you, I believe, where they were taken. Uh, and so you can't go somewhere in Germany. You can't go to a fast food restaurant. You can't go to a yoga studio. You can't go buy some shoes without being confronted and having to see as you look down what was done in your name by this country. That millions and millions of Jewish people and other ethnic groups and other demographics were systematically killed in this country's name. And what Germany and Germany is not perfect. There's still anti-Semitism in Germany. There's still issues, and I don't lift them up as perfection, but I lift them up as something that is reflective of a state sanctioned effort to attempt to account for what was done. And so I think that's powerful, right? And I think, like, what would that look like if we had that for slavery here, where like you couldn't walk into a building without thinking about having to confront that building was a place where families were separated and sold, that you couldn't walk into a restaurant without having to account for the fact that that restaurant was built on top of a former place where, a former auction block. And not even just in the context of slavery, but like, what if we did that for indigenous removal? What if we did that for indigenous genocide? What if we did that for Japanese American internment? What if we did that for all sorts of things that were state-sanctioned efforts to oppress and systemically kill different groups of people throughout this country? And I think that those things, those small objects, can serve as a portal and a constant reminder that our country has a lot to do to repair the harm that it enacted on so many people. And I think when we are constantly confronted with things that force us to remember what has been done to people, we then remember that the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is not because of the people in those communities, but it is because of what has been done to those communities generation after generation after generation. And I'll end with this. I think of this Baldwin essay all the time. It's called A Talk to Teachers. And he wrote it. It was based on a speech he gave in 1963 to a group of New York City educators, and I think he published it in 1964. And in it, he says a lot of remarkable things because he's Baldwin. But one of the things that stands out to me is that he says the role of the teacher, or rather, he says that the Black child is told over and over and over again that they are criminal. But the role of the teacher, and he's saying teacher literally here, but also as a sort of metonym for the larger society, the role of the teacher is to help that Black child understand that they are not criminal, but it is the society and the history that created the conditions that that child has been born into that is in fact the criminal. And it's a simple and in many ways intuitive thing, but it's a distinction that I think so many of us have not internalized because we've been made to internalize so much pathology about ourselves and about our community. And I saw that in my students. I saw that in my high school students when I was a high school English teacher. I see that in my students in the prisons and jails where I teach. And so I think that ultimately this book was written for like a younger version of me who wanted the language, who wanted the toolkit, who wanted the framework, who wanted the history to be able to more effectively name and identify the ways that this country was lying to me. And I think that there's so much power and there's so much freedom, there's so much liberation in being able to identify the lies that this country tells you about yourself.
Right.
Because you don't have to accept, because you know that we all have agency and we all have free will and we are all able to make decisions about the trajectory of our lives. But those things are shaped and animated by forces that existed long before we ever did. And if we're going to be honest about what it means to create a more equitable system in which you don't have two young people who grow up in fundamentally different circumstances and work equally as hard and have their lives end up on different trajectories because of nothing but the circumstances they were born into. If we're going to even that proverbial playing field, then we have to account for what makes the playing field uneven in the first place. And so this book is an effort, is one contribution to that effort.
Wow. It's definitely a huge contribution. I want to thank you for joining us this evening. Your fam, come by, see us anytime. You know, we're going to be following you. Fam, get this book, How the Word is Passed, Clint Smith. But more than this, I want to thank you for giving us a tool that we can use toward our own liberation. Simply because, you know, the gravity of this book. And how just from reading it, I was changed when I read this book. And so I thank you for your mastery of history and the mastery that you're going to bring to everybody who reads it. So thank you so much. Have an amazing evening. We look forward to touching bases with you again. To our viewers and those who support Push Black, thank y'all so much. Remember, you can get the book by clicking in our link, How the Word is Passed, Clint Smith. Y'all have a good evening, and thank you.
Thank y'all so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.